They found the drugs in her locker at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. That was the detail that never made sense to Iris Vance, the timing. Not the accusation itself, though that was staggering enough. Not the fact that two supervisors she had worked alongside for 3 years stood in the doorway and watched while a security officer rifled through her things. It was the timing. Her shift ended at midnight. Whoever had put those pills in her locker knew exactly how long they had. Iris had been a travel nurse for 4 years before she took the staff position at Hargrove Regional Medical Center in Denton, Texas. She was 31 years old, a veteran of 2 combat support hospitals in Kuwait and Germany, and the kind of person who kept her stethoscope wound in a perfect loop because she'd learned early on that sloppy habits in small things led to sloppy habits in the ones that mattered. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't political. She showed up on time, stayed late when patients needed her, and went home to her apartment and her cat and whatever paperwork the VA still needed from her most recent disability review. She had a limp. Not severe. Most patients didn't notice it for the first few days. A roadside IED in 2019 had shattered 3 bones in her left foot, and the surgical repair had been good but not perfect. On long shifts, especially the double shift she'd been pulling lately to cover for 2 nurses out on leave, the foot swelled. She wore compression socks. She kept ibuprofen in her bag and tried not to think about it. She wasn't thinking about it on the night everything changed. She was charting notes on a post-op patient in room 14 when Supervisor Dwayne Hollister appeared in the doorway. Hollister was a big man with a soft voice he used like a weapon. The quieter he got, the worse the news. He was very quiet that night. "Vance, need you to step out for a minute." She finished the sentence she was typing. "Give me 2 seconds. Now, please." The hallway was empty in that particular way hallways get at night. The lights dimmed to 30%. The cleaning crew already done with this wing, the nearest nurse's station 60 feet away. Standing next to Hollister was a woman Iris didn't recognize wearing a badge clipped to a lanyard that read Hargraphic. Dowson. Young, maybe 25, with the kind of rigid posture that people get when they're trying to look more certain than they feel. "We've received a report," Hollister said, "that controlled substances may have been removed from the dispensary without authorization. We need to check your locker." Iris looked at him, then at Dawson, then back at him. "My locker. Standard procedure." It wasn't, actually. She knew the protocol. A pharmacist had to be present. There had to be written documentation. The nurse in question had the right to a union representative if she requested one. She almost said all of this. Then she thought about how it would sound. Defensive. Like someone who had something to hide. "Fine," she said. "Let's go." The locker room was at the end of the east corridor. Hollister and Dawson followed her in. Her locker was number 34, bottom row, the one with the small dent on the lower left corner from the time someone's rolling cart had clipped it. She dialed the combination and opened it. There was a brown paper bag on the top shelf. It hadn't been there when she'd started her shift 8 hours ago. Dawson stepped forward before Iris could move and opened the bag with gloved hands. Inside were 2 prescription bottles. Oxycodone. 120 tablets total, according to the labels. "Those aren't mine," Iris said. "Mrs. Vance, those are not mine. I have never taken a controlled substance from this floor. You can pull the dispensary records right now tonight, and you will not find my name on an oxycodone withdrawal at any point during my entire time here." Hollister looked at the floor. "We're going to need your badge." She stared at him. "You're suspending me. Pending investigation, Dwayne." She hadn't used his first name in 3 years of working together. He looked up. "You know me." He didn't answer. She handed over the badge. She drove home in silence, and it wasn't until she was sitting in her car in her apartment parking lot, unable to make herself go inside, that she started to understand what had just happened. Not the mechanics of it. She could reconstruct those easily enough. Someone had access to her locker combination, either by watching her or by accessing the master list in HR. Someone had access to controlled substances, which meant either pharmacy, dispensary, or someone with a key to the secured medication cabinet on her floor. Someone had timed it for 13 minutes before the end of her shift, which meant they knew her schedule. This wasn't random. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. No words. Just a smiley face emoji. She screenshot it, locked her phone, and went inside. The union sent a representative named Kevin Ardmore to meet her at the hospital's HR office 2 days later. Ardmore was a compact, energetic man in his 50s who smelled like coffee and took notes in a cramped, rapid handwriting she could barely read upside down. He'd handled 46 disciplinary cases in the past 3 years, he told her, and he'd won 38 of them. He didn't say what had happened to the other 8. The HR director was a woman named Sandra Pruitt. She was professionally sympathetic in the way that people are when sympathy costs them nothing and admission costs them everything. She explained that the investigation would take 4 to 6 weeks, that Iris would remain on unpaid suspension during that period, and that the hospital's legal team would be reviewing the circumstances. Iris asked 3 questions. Was there a camera in the locker room that night? Pruitt said the cameras in that section had been undergoing a scheduled maintenance review. Who reported the alleged theft? Pruitt said she couldn't disclose that during an active investigation. When exactly did the maintenance review on the cameras begin? A pause. I'd have to check the records. Ardmore caught Iris's eye across the table. He wrote something down. She went home. She walked 3 miles because her therapist from the VA had told her that movement helped when anxiety started to compound. And 3 miles was what she could do without the foot becoming a problem. She thought about the bag in the locker. She thought about the cameras. She thought about the text message which she'd already forwarded to Ardmore and which he'd forwarded to the union's legal contact. She also thought about Beckett Nouri. Beckett Nouri was a pharmacist at Hargrove. They weren't friends. Not exactly. They were people who ate lunch in the same break room 3 days a week and had ended up in a lot of the same conversations about hospital administration, staffing ratios, the slow institutional erosion of things that used to work. He was 34, Iranian-American, meticulous in a way that made some people nervous and that Iris had always read as competence. He had mentioned once, 6 weeks ago, that he'd noticed something off in the dispensary reconciliation reports. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. She called him. He picked up on the second ring and said, "I was wondering when you'd call." She sat down on the edge of her bed. "You know, I heard you were suspended. I know what that's about. Tell me." There was a pause. Not a hesitant pause, a careful one, not on the phone. "Can you meet me?" They met the next morning at a diner 6 miles from the hospital. Nouri had dark circles under his eyes and a cup of coffee he kept turning in his hands without drinking. He told her what he'd found. Over the previous 4 months, controlled substances had been disappearing from the dispensary in small amounts. Small enough to stay under the standard audit threshold, which was set at a level that caught large-scale diversion but missed anything incremental. Nouri had noticed because he'd been doing a personal reconciliation project, checking the records manually as part of a continuing education module. The pattern was consistent, withdrawals logged correctly, but the physical inventory coming up short, never by more than 2 or 3 doses at a time. "I reported it," he said. 6 weeks ago, to Hollister. Iris set down her fork. "To Hollister, yes, and nothing happened. Nothing happened. He told me the discrepancy was probably data entry error and that he'd flag it for the next quarterly review." She thought about the maintenance review on the locker room cameras. She thought about the timing. 13 minutes before the end of her shift. "Someone needed a place to put the blame," she said. "You were the newest staff nurse on the floor. You had a disability claim pending. So there's paperwork showing you use pain management. And you're not from here. No family, no connections, no one who would make noise, except I am making noise." Nouri looked up. "Yeah," he said, "you are." She asked him to document everything, the reconciliation data, the report he'd filed, the date and content of his conversation with Hollister. He said he already had. He pulled a USB drive from his jacket pocket and put it on the table. "I made copies," he said, "before anyone could ask me to delete anything." Iris took the drive. She looked at it for a moment. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I reported it and they tried to use it to hurt you instead of fix it." He shrugged, but it wasn't a casual shrug. "That's not something I can live with." She kept the drive in the inner pocket of her jacket for the next 9 days. She didn't take it anywhere obvious. She met with Ardmore twice more and with the union's attorney, a woman named Carol Thace, who specialized in healthcare worker cases and had a manner that reminded Iris of the best officers she'd served under, calm, direct, and completely without theatrics. Thias told her that the dispensary data combined with Nouri's documented report to Hollister created what she called a meaningful evidentiary problem for the hospital. Which means what exactly? Ardmore asked. It means, Thias said, that their cleanest outcome is to make this go away before it gets to a formal hearing. Iris didn't want it to go away. She was careful not to say that out loud during the meeting, but Thias seemed to understand it anyway. After Ardmore left, Thias looked at her across the table and said, "You want accountability. I want to know who put those pills in my locker, and I want them to not be able to do it to anyone else. That's going to take longer. I know, and it's going to be harder on you than settling would be." "I know that too." Thias nodded. She made a note. "Okay then." The investigation that the hospital had promised would take 4 to 6 weeks, stretched to 7 before the Texas State Board of Nursing sent its own investigator. His name was Garrett Lowe, and he was the kind of person who made people nervous without meaning to. Very still, very attentive, the type who listened all the way to the end of a sentence before he started forming a response. He interviewed Iris for 3 hours, not in a hostile way, but in the exhaustive way that meant he was building something, and he needed every piece to fit. She told him everything. She started with the shift itself, the locker, the brown bag. She told him about the timing, the camera maintenance, the text message she'd received that night. She told him about Nouri, about the reconciliation data, about the report to Hollister. She answered every question he asked and volunteered details she thought might matter. At the end of the 3 hours, Lowe sat back and said, "Have you filed a complaint with the hospital's ethics hotline?" "I didn't know there was one. Most hospitals are required to have one. Hargrove does. It routes to an independent third-party monitor, not to internal administration." She filed it that afternoon. 3 weeks later, things began to move. The ethics monitor's report triggered an external audit of the dispensary records. The audit found a pattern of controlled substance discrepancies over 14 months. Not 4, as Nouri had believed, but 14. The amounts were small. The method was consistent. The person whose badge had been used to access the secured medication cabinet during several of the discrepancy periods was a charge nurse named Alan Pruitt. Iris didn't know Pruitt well. She'd worked a handful of shifts alongside him, found him competent and somewhat cold, and had no particular feelings about him either way. When she heard his name, her first reaction wasn't anger. It was a strange, flat exhaustion, the particular kind that comes from realizing the thing that hurt you wasn't personal, wasn't targeted, wasn't even really about you at all. You were just the nearest available surface. Pruitt resigned the day before the hospital's legal team formally notified him of the audit findings. He submitted his resignation via email at 6:17 in the morning, and by 8 a.m., Hollister had been placed on administrative leave pending a review of his handling of Nouri's original report. Iris heard about it from Ardmore, who called her while she was walking her 3 miles and started talking so fast she had to ask him to slow down. "They're reinstating you," he said. "Full pay for the suspension period, no mark on your record, and they want to have a meeting next week about next steps." "What kind of next steps?" "That's what we're going to find out." The meeting was in a conference room on the hospital's administrative floor, which Iris had never been to before. The people in the room were Pruitt from HR, now considerably less professionally sympathetic and considerably more careful. The hospital's general counsel, a man named Walsh, who had the practice-neutral expression of someone who spent a lot of time in rooms like this. Thias, who had brought a yellow legal pad and used it. And a woman Iris didn't recognize who introduced herself as Dr. Pamela Osei, the hospital's new chief compliance officer. Dr. Osei was the reason the meeting went differently than Iris had expected. Osei had been brought in from outside, hired in the weeks after the ethics monitor report had landed. Iris learned later, specifically because the board had recognized that internal compliance had failed at multiple levels. She was 53, had an MD and a law degree, and had previously spent 8 years with the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. She spoke to Iris directly, without the buffer of Walsh's careful neutrality, and she asked a question that none of the others had asked. "What would have made this harder to do to you?" Iris looked at her. "I'm sorry, Pruitt operated for 14 months before any single structural check caught him. Your report would have gone through Hollister, who had a reason to suppress it. The locker room cameras were on a maintenance cycle that conveniently aligned with the timing. The audit threshold was set too high to catch incremental diversion. None of those things were about you specifically. They were systemic failures. Osi folded her hands. So I'm asking, what would have made this harder to do to you? It was the right question. It was the question Iris had been asking herself in different forms for the past 7 weeks. She answered it. She talked about audit thresholds that needed to be lowered. She talked about a reporting pathway that didn't route through direct supervisors. She talked about camera maintenance schedules being staggered so that no single system went dark at a predictable time. She talked about mandatory response timelines when a pharmacist or staff member filed a discrepancy report. Osi wrote it all down. Walsh looked increasingly uncomfortable. Pruitt looked at the table. Theus, sitting beside Iris, said nothing. She didn't need to. 2 months later, Hargrove Regional announced a set of operational reforms to its controlled substance management and internal reporting protocols. They framed it as a proactive improvement initiative. They did not mention Iris Vance by name. They did not mention Alan Pruitt or Duane Hollister. The press release was 3 paragraphs long and thoroughly bureaucratic. Iris read it at 6 a.m., sitting at her kitchen table with her coffee, the day before she was due back for her first shift. She thought about the brown paper bag. She thought about the text message, the smiley face from a number that had since been disconnected, which the union's investigator had traced to a prepaid phone purchased at a gas station 2 miles from the hospital and never used again. She thought about Nuri handing her the USB drive across a diner table, saying, "I already made copies." She thought about Lowe, the board investigator, listening all the way to the end of every sentence. She thought about Dr. Osi asking, "What would have made this harder to do to you?" She had been asked, once by a reporter who'd caught wind of the story through courthouse records, whether she considered herself a whistleblower. She'd thought about it for a moment and said no. A whistleblower, she explained, was someone who came forward about something they'd seen from the outside. She'd been framed. She'd had no choice but to fight. The fighting had led somewhere useful, but she hadn't started it out of courage or principle. She'd started it because someone had put pills in her locker, and she knew they weren't hers, and she refused to let that be the last word. The reporter had asked if that distinction mattered. She'd said, "To me it does." She put her mug in the sink and picked up her bag and her compression socks and her stethoscope wound in its perfect loop. The drive to Hargrove was 22 minutes on a good morning, fewer if she took the highway. She took the highway. Her badge, new number, same name, cleared the parking garage gate at 6:54 a.m. The elevator took her to the 4th floor. The locker room was quiet. Her new locker was number 22, top row, clean and undented, smelling faintly of metal and disinfectant. She put her things inside, she closed the door, and she went to work.